Chapter 6 of Operation Terror by Murray Leinster. Read by Mark Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Operation Terror, Chapter 6. It was 9 o'clock at night when Lockley killed the porcupine, and 10 by the time Jill had gone back to sleep huddled between the projecting roots of a giant tree. Shortly after midnight, Lockley had been awakened when a skunk defeated a hungry predator within 100 yards of their bivouac. But some time in between, there was another happening of much greater importance elsewhere. Something came out of Boulder Lake National Park. All humans had supposedly fled from it. It was abandoned to the creatures of the thing from the sky. But something came out of it. Nobody saw the thing, of course. Nobody could approach it, which was the point immediately demonstrated. No human being could endure being within 7 miles of whatever it was. It was evidently a vehicle of some sort, however, because it swung terror beams before it, and terror beams on either side, and when it was clear of the park, it played terror beams behind it, too. Men who suffered the lightest touch of those sweeping beams of terror and anguish moved frantically to avoid having the experience again. So when something moved out of the park and sent wavering terror beams before it, men moved to one side or the other and gave it room. On a large-scale map in the military area command post, its progress could be watched as it was reported. The reports described a development of unbearable beam strength which showed up as a bulge in the cordon's roughly circular line. That bulge, which was the cordon itself moving back, moved outward and became a half-circle some miles across. It continued to move outward, and on the map it appeared like a pseudopod extruded by an enormous amoeba. It was the area of effectiveness of a weapon previously unknown on Earth, the area where humans could not stay. Deliberately, the unseen moving thing severed itself from the similar and larger weapon field which was its birthplace and its home. It moved with great deliberation toward the small town of Maplewood, 20 miles from the border of the park. Jeeps and motorcycles scurried ahead of it, just out of reach of its beams. They made sure that houses and farms and all inhabited places were emptied of people before the moving terror beams could engulf them. They went into the town of Maplewood itself and frantically made sure that nothing alive remained in it. They went on to clear the countryside beyond. The unseen thing from the park moved onward. High overhead there was a dull muttering like far-away thunder, but it was planes with filled bomb racks circling above the starlit land. There were men in those planes who ached to dive down and destroy this separated fraction of an invasion. But there were firm orders from the Pentagon. So long as the invaders killed nobody, they were not to be attacked. There was reason for the order in the desire of the government to be on friendly terms with a race which could travel between the stars. But there was an even more urgent reason. The aliens had not yet begun to murder, and it was suspected that they had a horrifying power to kill. So it was firmly commanded that no bomb or missile or bullet was to be used unless the invaders invited hostilities by killing humans. Their captives, the crew of a helicopter, might be freed if aliens and men achieved friendship. So for now, no provocation. The thing which nobody saw moved comfortably over the ground between the park and Maplewood. In the center of the weapon field there was a something which generated the terror beam and probably carried passengers. Whatever it was, it moved onward and into Maplewood, and for 7 miles in every direction troops watched for it to move out again. Artillerymen had guns ready to fire upon it if they ever got firing coordinates and permission to go into action. Planes were ready to drop bombs if they ever got leave to do so. And a few miles away there were rockets ready to prove their accuracy and devastating capacity if only given a launching command. But nothing happened. Not even a flare was permitted to be dropped by the planes far up in the sky. A flare might be taken for hostility. The thing from the park stayed in Maplewood for 2 hours. At the end of that time, it moved deliberately back toward the park. It left the town untouched, save for certain curious burglaries of hardware stores and radio shops and a garage or two. It looked as if intensely curious, not human beings had moved from their redoubt, Boulder Lake, to find out what civilization human beings had attained. They could guess at it by the buildings and the homes, but most notably in the technical shops of the inhabitants. It went slowly and deliberately back into the park. Humans moved cautiously back into the area that had been emptied. Not many, but enough to be sure that the thing had really returned to the place from which it had come. Soldiers were tentatively entering the again abandoned town of Maplewood when the unseen thing changed the range of its weapon bearing on that little city. It was then presumably not less than 7 miles on its way back to Boulder Lake. The military had congratulated itself on what they'd learned. The beam projectors at the lake had a range of much more than 7 miles, but this movable, unidentifiable thing carried a lesser armament. From it, men and animals 7 miles away were safe. This was notable news. Then the unseen object did something. The terror beam that flicked back and forth doubled in intensity. The soldiers just re-entering Maplewood smelled foulness and saw bright lights. Bellowings deafened them. They fell with every muscle rigid in spasm. Beyond them, other men were paralyzed. For 5 minutes, the invaders' mobile weapon paralyzed all living things for a distance of 15 miles. Then for 30 seconds it paralyzed living things for a distance of 30 miles. For a bare instant it convulsed men and animals for a greater distance yet. And all these victims of the terror beam knew, thereafter, an invincible horror of the beam. The thing from the park which nobody had seen went back into the park. And then men were permitted to return to exactly the same places they'd been allowed to occupy before the thing began its excursion. It seemed that nothing was changed, but everything was changed. If there were mobile carriers of the invasion weapon, then victory could not be had by a single atom bomb fired into Boulder Lake. There might be a dozen separate mobile terror beam generators scattered through the park. Any atomic attack would need to be multiplied in its violence to be certain of results. Instead of 1 bomb, there might be a need for 50. They would have to destroy the park utterly, even its mountains, and the fallout from so many atom bombs simply could not be risked. The invaders were effectively invulnerable. While this undesirable situation was being demonstrated, Jill slept heavily between 2 roots of a very large tree, and Lockley dozed against a nearby tree trunk. He believed that he guarded Jill most vigilantly. He awoke at dawn with the din of bird-song in his ears. Jill opened her eyes at almost the same instant. She smiled at him and tried to get up. She was stiff and sore from the hardness of the ground on which she'd slept. But it was a new day, and there was breakfast. It was porcupine cooked the night before. "Somehow," said Jill as she nibbled at the bone, "somehow I feel more cheerful than I did." "That's a mistake," Lockley told her. "Start out with a few premonitions and the day improves as they turn out wrong. But if you start out hoping, the day ends miserably with most of your hopes denied." "You've got premonitions?" she asked. "Definitely," he said. It was true. As yet, he knew nothing of last night's temporary occupation of a human town, but he believed he knew how the terror beam worked even if he couldn't figure out a way to generate it. He could imagine no defense against it. But if Jill had awakened feeling cheerful, there was no reason to depress her. She'd have reason enough to be dejected later, beginning with proof of Vale's death and going on from there. "We might listen to the news," she suggested.